Okay, now we're live. Um, Greetings, friends and comrades. Welcome to another interview segment hosted by the Midwestern Marx Institute for Marxist Theory and Political Analysis. Today we will be talking with Professor Gabriel Rockhill about his recent article titled Capitalism's Court Jester, Slavoj Žižek, which you can find linked to the description of this live stream. Gabriel Rockhill is a Franco-American philosopher, cultural critic, and activist. He is the founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop and professor of philosophy at Villanova University. His books include Counterhistory of the Present, Untimely Interrogations into Globalization, Technology, Democracy, which was published in 2017, Interventions in Contemporary Thought, History, Politics, Aesthetics, which was published in 2016, Radical History and the Politics of Art, which was published in 2014, and Logic of History, which was published in French in 2010. In addition to his scholarly work, he has been actively engaged in extra academic activities in the art and activist worlds, as well as a regular contributor to public intellectual debate. You can find him on Twitter at Gabriel Rockhill. Comrade Gabriel, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Nice. So I guess we can get started right away. I remember as an undergraduate philosophy major getting into Marxism, Žižek was the main person who would pop up for me to watch. It felt that regardless of what I was watching, somehow Žižek was in the mix. Naturally, I took a liking for this quirky fella who was always introduced as the world's best known Marxist and the most dangerous philosopher in the West. I remember he would reach conclusions I would disagree with, but always kept coming back to here. After all, this man kept citing what seemed to be an infinite amount of names I had yet to engage with in my young philosophical career. He must be really smart, I thought. Let me continue checking in to see if at some point I finally come to understand what he's really about. The more I got to this point, the more ridiculous his self-labeling as a communist seemed to me. In your article, you hint at a somewhat youthful captivation with the sniffling Jester. Can you speak a bit about your initial engagements with Žižek as an undergraduate student? And can you elaborate on the story where the editorial in which you published a translation of a Rancière book made you get an introduction from Žižek? Also, since Žižek is a part of this larger phenomenon you describe as the global theory industry, which includes thinkers like Alain Badiou, whom you studied with, can you tell us how that went? And in the process, maybe describe what you mean by the global theory industry?
Great. That's an expansive question, but a great place to start. So I first encountered Žižek as a young student in the early 90s in the United States, when a lot of the dominant discourse was deconstruction, kind of postmodernism, post-structuralism, and Žižek burst onto the scene being labeled this kind of, Lacanian, Marxist, radical, dangerous thinker, etc. And I shared with you the kind of enthusiasm of a young person who, personally, I was generally ignorant of history, political economy, the history of class struggle. I've been educated, after all, in the imperial core, and therefore I lacked really fundamental reference points about just the nature of the world that I was living in. And there was something sexy and cool and exciting about someone who could talk to someone like me. And I do really think that Žižek pitches to the youth culture in general and is a kind of force for bringing people in at a certain level. But the difficulty with that is that his most profound insights, of which there are very, very few, are all borrowed from the Marxist tradition. And what he does is he mixes those insights in an eclectic kind of homo fashion with non-Marxist and often anti-Marxist discourses and modes of analysis. And what you're left with is a kind of cultural mashup where you still get glimmerings of the Marxist tradition, but they've been commodified. And they've been commodified because of the way in which they've been crushed and subjected to ideological elements from the larger kind of theory and culture industry. And so it did not take very long for me to figure out that Žižek was not someone who had a really robust political and philosophic project that was actually linked to the liberation of the global working class. He struck me as someone who had a careerist orientation and an opportunist orientation. And even though I could sense that early on, it became confirmed much later on as I got to know his work better. In the case of the translation that I did, I ended up translating a book by Jacques Rancière, who is an anti-communist anarchist. And I didn't have my politics fully sorted at that point in time, and thought that there was something more to Rancière than there actually is. And I was mainly interested actually in his aesthetic work and some of the history of art stuff that he's done, some of which is solid, but again, suffers from an anti-communism and a lack of materialist analysis. But that's another story. In any case, in the case of Žižek, the only way that I could get a translation published that I had already worked on was by finding someone who had a lot of credibility and symbolic capital within the theory industry who would be willing to preface it. And so, in short, I was given the condition that I could, publish this translation if Žižek wrote the introduction for it. And this itself speaks volumes to the way in which the global theory industry operates, and also how we need to understand it. Because at the end of the day, my critique of Žižek is not an ad hominem critique. It's not a critique of an individual person. It's a critique of a system that produces someone like Žižek and promotes him as the most important thinker, the most dangerous thinker, etc. And so the fact that I would be basically obliged, if I wanted the translation to come out, to work with someone who is a charlatan and an opportunist really demonstrates how that whole system works. And it just became much worse after I ended up accepting that, because he ended up writing the preface basically to a different book than the one that I had translated, but wanted me to go ahead and write, just basically change the title of the book and run it anyway. And so that revealed to me, and very close up, because I'd been working in Paris at that point in time with Derrida and Badiou and other kind of leading luminaries of French theory, it revealed to me the kind of crass nature of his intellectual production. And I'm not the only one who has had kind of close-up stories. Anyone who's kind of in the mix, so to speak, knows that Žižek is not only sloppy, but kind of takes pride in being someone who will, simply not follow up on scholarly rigor in any really serious way whatsoever. And so anyway, there's that aspect to it. But then to come back to your kind of larger question, which I think is really important, is that a lot of this work then addresses the question of the global theory industry. And so the critique that I just put out of Žižek is part of a larger book project, which is tentatively entitled The Intellectual World War, on the failed attempt to kill the idea, or the very idea, of communism. And it looks at the material forces that have been marshaled by the capitalist world in order to denigrate not only actually existing socialism in any manifestation that it takes, but also all of the theoretical work in the Marxist tradition, and to replace the historical materialist tradition with a kind of compatible left traditions of thought. And in the case of those like Žižek or Badiou or Hart or Negri or Rancière, Judith Butler, we could add a lot of people, Ernesto Laclau, Chantal Mouffe, the list goes on and on and on. This is a very particular segment of the global theory industry, because of course that industry is actually dominated by people like Samuel Huntington and Francis Fukuyama, who do the kind of direct bidding of US imperialism. But the role of these particular figures that I just mentioned is that they're radical recuperators. What I mean by that is that they are tasked with, and have tasked themselves with, producing purportedly radical discourses that call everything into question: the history of Western metaphysics, the existence of man, enlightenment, European thought in general, all of these grand kind of monolithic things. And they appear to be unorthodox and transgressive and liberatory in various ways. But if you go through the details, as I have, because I studied very closely not only this tradition, but within this tradition, and was trained within this tradition, and unfortunately for a long time, quite honestly, I believed in certain aspects of this tradition, you realize that they are all profoundly anti-communist. There are different versions of this, and it takes on different forms, but they're principally against what they refer to as totalitarianism, which is, of course, a kind of, originally it was a concept that was developed in the communist tradition, but then it was recuperated by the US national security state and intellectual figures like Hannah Arendt in order to discredit actually existing socialism and try to affiliate it with fascism, which is an impossible intellectual task because they're, world historical enemies and fought World War II basically around that kind of, or was constructed around that opposition between fascism on the one hand and socialism on the other. And so that critique that I have of Žižek is part of a larger critique of the radical recuperators and the function that they play in the global theory industry, which is to recuperate the possibilities of radical critique within the anti-communist camp and the anti-socialist camp. In other words, what they do is they police the left border of critique. And they also are part of an imperial project, a project of cultural imperialism, because as everyone knows, or I presume a lot of people know who are familiar with intellectual traditions outside of the United States, there's a way in which those who are promoted within the imperial core, within the Euro-American world, become kind of sacred values in the larger globalized intellectual world. And so if you're in Argentina, or if you're in South Africa, or if you're in India, and you're an intellectual and you operate in certain circles, it is almost a requirement that you have some familiarity with Foucault or Badiou or people of this ilk, Derrida and others, even if you tend to disagree with them for whatever reason it might be. And that's not the case with the thinkers who have been excluded from this tradition, right? Those who maintain a more historical historical materialist mode of analysis. So that's another function that they play, is they play a really specific role as radical recuperators within the larger system of cultural imperialism. But maybe I'll stop there. I don't know if I got to every aspect of your question, but I'm sure you'll bounce back to me if there's more.
Yeah, that was excellent. I really appreciate your concept of radical recuperators. The way that we've thought about that phenomenon in the past is as if the ruling class realizes that because of the periodic cycles of mass crisis of capitalism, people are going to end up in positions where they want to descend to the existing order. And they need some form of a controlled counter-hegemony where they know that if they're there, they're safe because the established order isn't being substantially opposed. And I think it's very easy to assume that this is just like, intellectual bickering. And it's not activities that are sustained within the academy, because all of these ideas and modes of thoughts and outlooks and perversions of Marxism, they roll into the sphere of activism through the academy itself, through NGOs, through the media, through pop culture. So it's something that has some weight and some stakes when it comes to organizing for socialism. It's not just something that I think is relegated to the academy.
Yeah, absolutely. Just very quickly on that, Carlos, I couldn't agree more that it's a controlled counter-hegemony, right? Because at the end of the day, what a lot of these figures do is that they are working for and pitching to the capitalist apparatus of knowledge production that promotes them internationally, right? And so there's a relationship of complicity between their intellectual production and what the system wants. And it does function very much like a release mechanism, so that instead of getting involved in political organizing or doing things of a more radical sort, one will, buy a Žižek book or go to a trendy book talk in Chelsea or hang out in an art gallery and feel radical. And so what it is also is the translation of the potentialities of radicalism into consumerism. And this is one of the main ways in which you take active subjects, potentially active subjects, and you turn them into passive consumers of cultural products. And so I just wanted to hammer that point home because I couldn't agree more.
Likewise. And what's sad is that one of the few points that you mentioned that Žižek is right, because he takes it from the classical traditional Marxist tradition, is one of these. He makes the constantly references the example of Starbucks using the portion of the thing you buy for to go to some NGO or something, and he talks about how activism has been consumerized, has been incorporated into consumptive practices of capitalism, but he is himself a part of that phenomenon that he seems to describe. A big portion of the first part of Žižek's anti-communist career is located in the now overthrown and, frankly, criminally NATO-bombed socialist Yugoslavia. Can you speak a bit about Žižek's anti-communist activities in Yugoslavia? What sort of nefarious Western imperialist forces was he allying and or collaborating with? And just for context, can you speak a little bit about socialist Yugoslavia itself? What were some of the achievements it brought its working masses And how have these been undermined by the forces Zizek, a now self-proclaimed communist, supported and to some extent led, specifically in the case of co-founding and leading the Liberal Democratic Party over there?
Yeah, it's important that the analysis that I'm doing is of Zizek's theoretical practice, which needs to be understood within the larger social world in which he operates. And a theoretical practice isn't one that you only do subjectively. It's always in relationship to objective coordinates. And so the fact that he grew up in an actually existing socialist state, Yugoslavia, which was an independent, socialist state in the sense that it wasn't aligned on and had somewhat of a complicated relationship to the zone of Soviet influence. But Zizek himself was drawn to Western pop culture, Western theoretical traditions over and against what he's sometimes described as the kind of dogmatic Marxism of the Yugoslav state. For the record, it's also very important to know that Yugoslavia, and this has been very well documented by a number of sources. I would send your readers and viewers, if they don't know it, to Michael Parenti's great book on Yugoslavia. But there's a lot of other work that has also foregrounded the fact that Yugoslavia was not only, a socialist state, but was extremely successful in developing a system, a socioeconomic system that looked out for and bolstered the lives of the most exploited and the most oppressed. So based on World Bank data, we know that the 2 decades before 1980, from 1960 to 1980, annual gross domestic product in the Yugoslavian, socialist Yugoslavia, grew by 6.1%. Medical care was free. The rate of literacy was 91%. Life expectancy was 72 years, right? But of course, as we also know, after a decade of, or once the West came in and through its imperialist endeavors, through the NATO bombing and other such things, we saw all of this plummet. And there was a massive assault on the working class globally, really, but it took particularly severe forms in, former socialist countries like Yugoslavia. And Žižek not only had a direct hand in this, he has proudly bragged about it repeatedly in various interviews and in some of the texts that he's written. I point to a lot of examples in the text, maybe just a few of the highlights really quickly. One is that Žižek's very first book was not on, Marx or even Althusser for that matter. It was on Martin Heidegger, who is an unrepentant Nazi. And Žižek also was the first person apparently to translate one of the books by Jacques Derrida into Slovenian. And Derrida, of course, made his career, amongst other things, by rehabilitating the work of Martin Heidegger and helping prop him up and make him into one of the quote unquote greatest philosophers of the 20th century. And of course, Derrida worked hand in glove with Paul de Man, who also has a very well documented Nazi history in the time that Derrida spent at Yale and various collaborations that they had together. And so what the young Žižek was attracted to intellectually was the tradition of Heideggerianism and neo-Heideggerianism that was anti-Marxist through and through. And he played a central role also in then participating in dissident movements in Yugoslavia, dissident movements that he himself has described as being driven by an interest in Heideggerianism and French theory. So this was the Western-oriented opposition that wanted to dismantle socialism, introduce capitalism, and one of the clear reasons for that is that he saw opportunities for himself as a petty bourgeois intellectual for social ascension. And so we have to understand his own individual theoretical practice as related to the larger coordinates of his existence and the recognition of greater possibilities in the capitalist world. And indeed, that's been the case, right? He's become one of the most famous philosophers in the capitalist world. I should also highlight, though, his work wasn't only theoretical. He was the principal weekly columnist for a dissident magazine, meaning an anti-communist magazine called Mladina, which has been accused in a very long and detailed report by the Yugoslav Communist Party of being backed by the Central Intelligence Agency. He also then, you referenced this very, in passing, he founded the liberal or co-founded the Liberal Democratic Party, and the name says all that you need to know. Žižek is a liberal who supports forms of so-called, plural democracy, or at least he was at that point in time. He kind of repackaged himself, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But he was very explicit, and I encourage all of your viewers and listeners, unfortunately on social media, sometimes people respond to things without actually reading and engaging them. If the people who have seen this article actually go through the 99 footnotes and read and listen to all of the documentary evidence that I marshal, they will see Žižek in his own words. And in his own words, he said, as president of Yugoslavia, he would substantially assist in the decomposition of ideologic real socialist apparatus. And he argued for planned privatizations, claiming, quote, more capitalism in our case would mean more security, right? So he took a pro-capitalist, pro-liberal, anti-socialist position. And moreover, he supported the ruling party for the first 10 years of post-socialist Yugoslavia, right? So it's not as if he ran for president and then all of a sudden, announced a mea culpa, he was wrong, the turn towards capitalism was horrific because it was destroying the lives of so many workers and laying them off, and there was there was even plummeting life expectancy and other such things. No, on the contrary, he continued to support the LDS, this Liberal Democratic Party that he helped co-found, while the IMF and the World Bank were pushing through brutal economic counter-reforms that led to the collapse of real wages, laying off of workers at a terrifying pace. There were massive declines in living standards. And so he saw on the ground, must have seen very clearly what was going on. But the Žižek that he kind of presents himself, we have to relate to the Žižek, the kind of practical Žižek or the practically oriented Žižek and the things that he's actually done as a political activist. And what we know is that he was against socialism in its state form and for civil society and dissident politics, so-called democratic politics, during the socialist government in Yugoslavia. And then once the socialist government was overthrown and there was a liberal bourgeois democracy put in place, he was for the state and against civil society. And not only that, he was also very much in support of the party that was behind, or was one of the principal driving forces behind Slovenia's joining of the European Union and of NATO. And of course, Žižek has a long-standing history of not only being Eurocentric, but very explicitly supporting the European Union, saying things like only Europe can save us. This is one of his most recent pieces that came out in Le Figaro, a French newspaper, and also a very strong supporter of NATO in certain instances, at least, like the criminal bombing of civilians and socialist infrastructure in Yugoslavia, as well as the current intervention in the Ukraine, the US proxy war in the Ukraine, in which he says that we need a stronger NATO and that any leftist worthy of their salt will be a supporter of, what he calls a supporter of Ukraine, which is basically a blind supporter for US proxy war, which has nothing to do with supporting the Ukrainian people. On the opposite, it's about using the Ukrainian people as cannon fodder for an imperialist project. But of course, there's more that could be said here, Carlos, but maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I remember when he put out that article, I believe it was in The Guardian, about Ukraine, asking for more bombs and more armaments to be sent over to Ukraine. Some people were surprised, but you shouldn't have been if you're familiar with his history and him asking for more bombs and that the bombs were being sent too late in the New Left Review back when Yugoslavia was being bombed. You mentioned Michael Parenti's book. I put the title in the chat. It's called To Kill a Nation, The Attack on Yugoslavia. It's a wonderful book. And it depicts, along with other texts that deal with the fall of Eastern European socialism, a process that historians have begun to call demodernization because of how bad conditions got in the years after the fall of socialism. Before jumping to the following scheduled question, you mentioned something that I would like to have you elaborate a little bit more on. You mentioned that he was repackaged from liberal Democrat to communist. Can you speak a little bit about how that process occurred?
Well, the way I referred to Žižek at one point in the article that we're talking about is as a native informant from the East. And so given the fact that he grew up in a socialist culture, inevitably was exposed to ideas in the Marxist tradition. As the Berlin Wall fell and then the Soviet Union was dismantled, Žižek caught the kind of rising tide of radical democracy discourse. This is the discourse affiliated with people like Ernesto Laclau, Chantal Mouffe, and others, Jacques Rancière a little bit later on, that consists in, basically saying that, well, yeah, we're pro-democracy, but we need this more radical form that's not just about forms of parliamentary representation and other such things, but not socialist, right? And that was really one of the things that catapulted Žižek early on. And I think there was some confusion about this based on some comments I saw in my work, referring to Žižek as a Pomo Radlib, precisely because this is what he was doing. He was working with the postmodernists who are Radlibs and taking a very similar position, in fact, very explicitly saying he was opposed to the global solution of the Marxist revolution. This is a position that he shares with Ernesto Laclau and Judith Butler, right? And so he very much is inscribed within this position. Another thing I'll just say very quickly is that we have to be attentive to people's theoretical practices, not simply their discourses. And so someone like Žižek, like a lot of the other figures for that matter who I've just mentioned, they'll use words in a lot of different ways to describe, redescribe, and contradict themselves in their descriptions. But if we're attentive to their practices, Žižek is very much practicing this kind of postmodern mashup, Radlib discourse that pilfers from Marxism but dilutes it into, or dilutes it with anti-Marxist and in particular liberal discourses, but some reactionary discourses like Heidegger as well. And one of the things that's interesting about the trajectory of Žižek is that as the Soviet-style socialism, or as Soviet-style socialism was being dismantled and his career was taking off in the West, he saw a second opportunity for this kind of opportunism that I alluded to earlier, and that was to begin presenting himself not simply as a pro-Western anti-socialist, but instead as a Marxist, and to embrace certain forms of Marxism, and in fact, to engage in what I refer to in the article, a kind of commie cosplay, right? He not only calls himself a Marxist, but he calls himself a Leninist, which is, of course, laughable given all of the things that I've just said and many other things that we could go into about his political and his philosophic career. He's anti-Leninist through and through. And in fact, he has an image of Leninism that is the same image that the extreme right has of Leninism, which is Leninism is just about power grabs and things like this. And so this is a marketing ploy on his part, and it's part of his radical recuperator image. He's the bad boy, native informant from the East who really knows what socialism is because he was there himself on the ground. He's got the kind of the equivalent of the street cred that a rapper would have, except for instead of it being the music industry that picks him up, it's the theory industry that picks him up. And then they use him and he uses them because he can play a role as a native informant and act as if he really knows what Marxism is, knows it from the inside. And he uses that as part of the kind of packaging of his radicality. And it's interesting the way that this has happened, right? Because with people like Badiou, and there's a whole clique of people who operate in these circles, and they did 3 volumes with Verso, The Idea of Communism, volumes 1, 2, and 3. All 3 of those books really present this new idea of communism. And I remember when they first came out, it was very radical because communism is like back on the agenda and people are talking about it again. Well, if you read those books, and particularly the acknowledgments, and you get a sense of what their center of gravity is, their center of gravity is very explicitly against actually existing socialism in just about every imaginable shape and form, with the potential exception of the Cultural Revolution for a few years that Badiou tends to fetishize in the anarchist sense of the attack on the headquarters and whatnot, but no support for actually existing socialist states. And so there's a commie cosplay repackaging of Marxism that's very saleable, very marketable, very trendy, and it works perfectly because it allows communism to be repackaged as anti-communism, as a project that's actually pitted against actually existing socialism. It also really confuses people, and it gets a lot of people who might be interested in socialism and communism to pick up their books and read them and then get lost in the obscurantism and all the references and things like this, but think, well, there must be something to it because there seems to be so much interest given the way in which they're commodified and marketed that, there's the kind of what I refer to as in the article again as intellectual commodity fetishism, right? That these are commodities that are produced by the global theory industry, and there's a fetishization around them that produces the sense that there must be something really powerful, even magical about what's going on there. And if I can't understand it, it must be my fault. I must just be stupid, right? as opposed to, and this is what I would encourage all people who read books by Badiou or Žižek or Hart or Negri and feel stupid to think about, particularly working class people, is to think, well, no, maybe you are not stupid. Maybe the system produces these obscurantist discourses to try to hoodwink people into believing, one, that they're stupid, but two, also that they have to aspire to this particular mode of discourse if they want to be engaged in Marxism. And as the great Michael Parenti pointed out, there's often a direct relationship actually between the clarity of someone's discourse and the clarity of their ideas. And so if you compare the writings that we just talked about to the writings of Michael Parenti, which working class people can easily understand, you see the difference very clearly. One is a commodified comic cosplay that's to obscure things, confuse people, make them feel dumb, not bring them into a collective struggle, but just get them to buy a book, read half of it, put it on the shelf, and remain demoralized, detached, and in kind of individual consumer culture, versus a mode of discourse and a theoretical practice that connects to people. It gives them tools, it brings them into a struggle that is meaningful to them because they can connect it to their actual real lives. And I think that that difference in theoretical practice is really essential. One is opportunist, one pitches to the capitalist culture industries. The other is invested in a collective transformation and is really part of the essence, I would say, if we want to use that terminology, or the core of the Marxist tradition, is that it's a tool for struggle and it should be understandable. It should be something that people can relate to and that brings them into a collective struggle that doesn't lead them to either individually fetishize an author or to be just struck in awe and incapable of criticizing them because they feel like they can't understand them and therefore they must be stupid.
That's wonderfully said. I really appreciate the point that you brought up of Parenti and the clarity of the ideas reflecting itself in the clarity of the writing. And one of the things that I have found specifically with Žižek is that part of his lack of clarity, especially when speaking more directly in line with the thinkers that he claims to be inspired by, and I can speak more to Hegel and Marx than to Lacan, is that he doesn't really know what he's talking about half of the time. They're really bad misinterpretations of things that specialists in those areas would catch very quickly, but he bounces from so many things that it makes it appear as if it's kind of mystical in the way that you said it. So enmeshed in his opportunism and anti-communism, as is usually the case, at least in my view, is a deeply embedded social chauvinism and a form of Eurocentrism, which you've been getting at. Can you elaborate a bit on this aspect of his anti-communism? Would you say that this is a general component of the global theory industry? Also, in this area, Roland Bohr has argued that Žižek holds, quote, a patronizing Orientalist attitude, end quote, towards socialist countries like China. While I agree with the sentiment, I tend to think the classical Marxist-Leninist label of social chauvinism is much more appealing than Edward Said's Orientalism. Was sticking to social chauvinism as opposed to adopting the post-colonial categorization of Orientalism a conscious choice for you?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I think that social chauvinism is a category that really needs to be reintroduced into contemporary discourse because it's not commonly used, but it was in the early 20th century, particularly in Marxist debates around World War I. And just to explain what it is or how it was conceived of at that point in time and then its relevance to today, Lenin, of course, drew heavily on the category of social chauvinism to index or reference the ways in which certain members of the working class in Europe were chauvinistic because they expressed their fealty to their national bourgeoisies and to the idea that they should defend their fatherland during World War I, and therefore line up on their national bourgeoisies against the interests of the international proletariat, right? So social chauvinism in that sense is a chauvinism regarding your own nation state or your own group, thinking that you're superior to others, elevating yourself above them, and actually fighting to defend that superiority, and thereby lining up on the interests of the imperialist powers in World War I. And Lenin also pointed out, and exactly as you said, that social chauvinism and opportunism are intimately intertwined, because one of the reasons that some of the workers and some of the socialist organizers of the Second International revealed social chauvinism is because that chauvinism itself is driven by the economic base, meaning that they were benefiting from the wages of colonialism. They're situated in the imperialist core. The state of their lives, even if they're exploited and oppressed in various ways, is superior to the state of the lives of the, quote unquote, slaves in the colonies. And that meant that their social chauvinism was also ultimately rooted in their fealty to imperialism and their dedication to maintaining an imperial system in which the European working class sat above the working class of those outside of Europe. And so the category of social chauvinism, I think, is very helpful for understanding contemporary politics. But we just have to understand social chauvinism in a slightly more general sense, meaning that social chauvinism is a zealous devotion to one's own group. And that group can be your nation state, and often is, like crass nationalism is a manifestation of social chauvinism. But it can also be one's region, like a dedication to, urban organizing as opposed to rural organizing, for instance. But it can also be race, it could be sex, it could be gender, it could be just about any any identity category. Right? So there's this devotion to your identity category as being superior to other identity categories. And that's, of course, combined with a denigration of and a disparagement of those outside of your group. Right? So Orientalism, if we understand it from a historical materialist vantage point, which is, of course, different from Said's Foucaultian inflected perspective, is one specific manifestation of social chauvinism, I would say. And there are many other manifestations thereof. And I think that the advantage of the category of social chauvinism is that it indicates the form of that relationship, right? Of a superiority of one's group over others, and that the content itself can change, right? There can be many very different forms of social chauvinism, and that a lot of the social chauvinistic attitude is baked into the, how to put it, well, there are two different aspects, actually. One is that social chauvinism is rampant within the imperialist core because of the widespread assumption that we, quote unquote, are the most developed, the most advanced, the leaders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also the phenomenon of the labor aristocracy that I was referring to before. And so the unequal exchange between the imperialist core and the colonial periphery, which makes it such that the working class in the imperialist core tends to be situated at a higher socioeconomic level than that of those at the periphery. And this has led to, and this comes to the issue of the global theory industry that we were talking about, to what I would refer to as an intellectual labor aristocracy. What I mean by that is the group of intellectuals who are feted by and promoted by the most powerful academic institutions in the imperial core. Right, those like Žižek, regularly invited to NYU, to the, all of these really prestigious institutions, I'm sure paid an enormous amount in keynotes, for keynote lectures and honoraria and things like this, and the junkets, so wined and dined and all of that. These figures, so if it be Žižek or Judith Butler or many, many others who we could lump into this, form part of a clique that is supported by this institutional mechanism, the Imperial University. And they operate above that of the other intellectuals, either within the imperialist core or internationally, for that matter. And that tends to breed an extremely profound form of social chauvinism. The assumption that the discourse that they traffic in is the most sophisticated, the most advanced, one that everyone everywhere in the world should be studying and learning. And the idea that any ideas from the periphery could only be of value if somehow they can be plugged into the symbolic economy of knowledge production in the imperial core, right? So someone like Spivak can be of value because she traffics in a Derridian discourse and herself is part of that kind of ascendant, kind of, how to put it, post-colonial intellectual labor aristocracy. The same with figures like, Dussell's infatuation with Levinas, or you can kind of go around the world and look at these different figures who are affiliated in various ways with the third world, in the sense that they might have some type of link to it in various ways, but they have been integrated within the imperialist core and have become major players in this intellectual labor aristocracy. And so what this social chauvinism also does is it makes people turn a blind eye to so many other forms of intellectual production. And I know that I've suffered from this immensely myself in my own intellectual and political development. When I was 19 or 20, I would much rather go and read the hot commodities produced by the Imperial University and publishing houses and things like this, meaning Žižek and Leclau and things like that, than sit down and crack some like book from 1914 that was published, by some unknown quantity that would be irrelevant to those debates or not packaged within those debates in such a way that it could be marketable in such a way. Because there's also this symbolic economy, right? Where if you want to have traction within the contemporary university, you better be able to talk about people like Foucault and Said and Dussel and people like this, but you don't have to talk about people like Parenti or Domenico Lasordo or Michel Cruscar or Michel Simon or Annie Laquaris or like lots of other names that we could name, or Thomas Sankara or Ajaz Ahmad or people like this who don't traffic in that same symbolic economy. And so anyway, there's more that could be said on this front, but I definitely want to make a pitch for reintroducing social chauvinism into contemporary discourse, not necessarily reintroducing it, but making it become part of a common way in which we can understand a certain kind of, almost moral and intellectual disposition that leads to a denigration of theoretical practices that do not traffic in the most commodified forms of theoretical practice that you get in the imperial core.
I'm with you there in bringing back social chauvinism. I don't think it should have ever left. And I think part of the paradox here is that some of these people who participate in this discourse, which completely ignores the actual periphery, they place themselves as the ones who speak for the periphery in areas where it is unspoken for. And more specifically, the post-colonial tradition is, I think, the archetype of doing this.
Absolutely.
You argue that Žižek and his and your former teacher, Badiou, are transcendental idealists. Can you elaborate a bit for the audience on what you mean by this? And considering the role neo-Kantianism played in eclecticizing the Marxism of, for example, the Second International and part of the Maoist trends within the Bolsheviks, do you see their transcendental idealism developing out of any of these variations of eclecticism we've seen infiltrated in some of the Marxisms of the past?
Yeah, the very first thing that I'd say is that when I refer to them as transcendental idealists, I'm referring to their theoretical practice, what they do, not necessarily what they say they do, because both Badiou and Žižek have different ways of describing their projects and redescribing their projects for that matter, often changing over time or changing their definitions over time. So that's very important for me. Albert Zemansky, I think, makes this point very clearly in a pamphlet that he wrote years ago, where he explains, well, if you want to know if somebody's a Trotskyist or a Maoist, etc., don't listen to what they say, look at what they do. And then you can really know, because there's plenty of people who will do one thing and say another thing, particularly the people that we're talking about. And so a transcendental idealist is one who begins with the assumption that there is a relationship between mind on the one hand, so ways of thinking, and the world on the other, and that these two meet in some capacity. And that transcendental idealism, of course, is a term that comes from Kant, but I'm not using it in a strictly Kantian sense. What I'm using it to index is that there's, for the sake of argument, I'll say there's just two different ways of thinking about this relationship. And that what Žižek and Badiou tend to do is they take empirical content, right? So Žižek will go and watch a Hitchcock movie or a blockbuster, or he'll go on a porn site, or whatever the empirical content. It'll also be he's just waiting in line at the airport to go give a long lecture, and he looks at the back of his coffee cup, and that's his empirical content, right? That's the empirical research that's being done. What's done with that empirical content, though, is that there's not a materialist analysis in the sense that historical materialists understand this, and I'll return to that in a moment. But instead, what's done with that is that there's a pre-established intellectual framework, which is what comes from the side of mind as opposed to world. And that intellectual framework is the system that Žižek has established, his system of ideas, or Badiou for that matter. And the relationship between the empirical content and the system of ideas is that it's taken by these thinkers, and it's remarkable, it's particularly clear when you read any of their work on history. I mean, they don't really do history, so it's kind of laughable when they try to do it, or art, or aesthetics, or culture, right? Because they take the empirical content, and the analysis consists in discovering within the empirical content their pre-established intellectual system. This creates an illusion, and a very powerful illusion, and that is that a Hitchcock movie, for instance, proves that Žižek's ideas, which are basically repackaged Lacanian ideas, are correct. There's two problems with that. One is that you do not establish the correctness of an idea based on one empirical content that you read that idea into, right? That's not the proof of an idea. That's not historical materialist analysis. The second is that there's a way in which those ideas that themselves are pre-formulated, their truth is presupposed, right? So the truth is presupposed, and then it's potentially confirmed by this empirical evidence. But the confirmation of that truth, the truth of the Žižekian system or the Badiousian system, is a truth that is like a castle of cards built in the air. It is dependent only upon itself, right? It's not dependent on a materialist foundation and a materialist analysis of actually existing reality, right? And so what transcendental idealists, as I understand the term, or I should say I'm using the term or appropriating the term, do is they pilfer empirical data that they don't subject to systemic analysis, that they then take to confirm their pre-established set of ideas, which themselves have never been proven to be true. This is the opposite of a historical materialist mode of analysis, because a historical materialist mode of analysis doesn't begin with a pre-established system of ideas and then cherry pick isolated empirical facts or elements that it shoehorns into that system of explanation. Instead, it begins in many ways the other way around. It begins with the recognition that there isn't mind over here and world over here, but instead a dialectical situation in which our thought processes themselves emerge out of and are constituted out of forces that come from a material world. Therefore, our modality of analysis is that we're subjects situated within an objective world who are trying to understand as best as possible the systemic nature of that objective reality, with no illusions of a God's eye view, like a Badiousian or Žižekian view, where you could stand outside and have a perfect philosophic system that would be pristine, and every card would be well placed, and every term would be well placed. I'm talking more about Badiou than Žižek, because his terms and concepts tend to be pretty scattershot and really messy. It's a really messy castle of cards. But for historical materialist mode of analysis, the only way that something is true is by constantly testing an ongoing system in relationship to actual practice. And that testing is collective. It's not individual. It's not based on, oh, I went and saw a Hitchcock movie and I had my idea about the Lacanian real confirmed. It is instead subjecting the world that is put forth to be analyzed to a systemic mode of examination that then constantly tests those claims over time and tweaks the system of analysis. So there's never a static system of ideas or philosophic system. There's an evolving and changing account of an evolving and changing reality, if you will. And the other thing that I would say is that that requires a, for lack of a better term, transdisciplinary, although I don't like that term, and it's an analysis of the social totality. So what both Badiou and Žižek do is they take these empirical data that are isolated, and they never give us an actual materialist analysis of the system that produces that empirical data. They don't give us an analysis of the social totality. So Žižek will look at Hitchcock films, but not ask the question of who produced the films, who paid for them, why were they produced, what was the system of production that made them in the first place? How did they circulate within the larger world? What was their reception? What was the entire kind of system of production, circulation, and consumption of the particular, cultural product that he is interested in. Instead, he isolates the aesthetic artifact and then just uses it as an example to illustrate his ideas. And I realize I kind of went on at length about that, but I didn't get to the second part of your point, which I think is really important, because neo-Kantianism is a complicated and diverse phenomenon that traverses a lot of the 19th and a lot of the 20th and early 21st century, for that matter. But one of the core elements that you get in various neo-Kantian traditions that is also very, very prevalent in French theory is an undialectical and even anti-dialectical mode of analysis, right? Just as I said before, the transcendental idealists think that they take mind and world and find a bridge between them, and they sometimes refer to that as kind of doing dialectics. It's not what dialectics is. Dialectics doesn't start with mind over here and world over here and the assumption that they're these fixed substances, if you will. It's a very Kantian mode of analysis, and it's a very non-dialectical mode of analysis. And so a lot of the neo-Kantian traditions were pushing back, of course, against the Hegelian traditions and the Marxist traditions that were manifesting instead a dialectical approach that makes their very approach kind of null and void. And so Kantianism and the reification of these kind of oppositions is a classic way in which you exit dialectical thinking, or you denigrate dialectical thinking. Like, a great example of this is the fact that so much of French theory is dedicated to this idea that Western thought is trapped within binary thinking and there's no way of getting out of it. And even if we try to get out of it, the idea of out is in opposition to it, and therefore we reinscribe the binary, and that's proof that binary thinking inhabits everything. Again, very, very Kantian or neo-Kantian. But the problem is that we're already out of binary thought, in the sense that dialectics is both a way of thinking and also the way in which the world operates through process and relations, etc., that is beyond the framing of binaries. And so all of that is to say that kind of neo-Kantian orientation that you find in various ways is a refusal of the kind of dialectical turn that you get in Hegel, and definitely the dialectical materialism that you then find in Marx. Carlos, I'm not sure if I got to all of the points that you raised, though, but I'll turn it back over to you to see if you want to mine down deeper or move on to another question.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. I couldn't agree any more with you. I think it comes down to a poverty of outlook. A poverty of outlook. I've been developing the concept of the purity fetish to describe it, but there are objective forces that are propelling this poverty of outlook, and which benefit from the lack of dialectical materialist analysis being prevalent on the left. There's this quote that Engels has that comes from a letter in 1890. He says, "What all these gentlemen lack is dialectics. For them, Hegel never existed. All they see is cause here, effect there." And I think that's as true today as it was in 1890. But piggybacking on that, you argue in your article that, quote, Žižek and Badiou choose specific empirical elements, a current event, a text, a Hollywood movie, a candy wrapper, the back of a cereal box, a Starbucks cup, a porn site, or literally anything else, particularly in the case of Žižek, that they contend confirms their pre-established theoretical model, thereby producing the illusion that it has been proven true, end quote. This seems to be the same sort of foisting of ideas onto reality that Lenin criticized Plekhanov for doing when he spoke of dialectics. Do you find it paradoxical that both Žižek and Badiou, while denouncing the development of dialectical materialism in the Soviet Union as mechanistic, sophistic, and vulgar, because of their own transcendental idealism, or at least in the way in which you're using it, from the real Marxist point of view, they're the ones that are actually mechanistic, sophistic, vulgar, and frankly, undialectical?
Yes. Should we go on to the next question, or should I? Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. In fact, it's a classic case of projection, right?
Right.
Where what these thinkers do themselves, which is precisely what they accuse others of doing, and that reveals a lot about the ways in which one of the things that they're invested in, because some of this question we kind of touched on in my response to the last question, one of the things that they're really invested in is developing not a collective mode of analysis where we'd have shared skills and tools that we would tweak together based on practice, right? And that's what the dialectical materialist and historical materialist traditions are. It's not like there's this fixed super system with mechanical laws and everything is reducible. And no, I mean, there's so many examples that we could point to within the Marxist tradition that has been rapidly critical of economism, reductionism, determinism, et cetera, precisely on the basis of a dialectical understanding, so that you don't have, determinism over here and freedom over here and society over here and an individual over here. No, you have a dialectical process in which subjects are forged out of a society within which they are marshaling their agency to either transform that society or perpetuate that society's main modes of action. And so the dialectical approach is very much a kind of collective tool to elucidate a shared world. And what the theoretical practice of figures like Badiou and Žižek is invested in is not that, right? They're invested in developing an idiosyncratic, very singular philosophic system that can be brand marketed as unique and as superior to the other philosophic systems on offer. And they compete with one another to sell their wares. And that means that the very foundation of their theoretical practice is the kind of mirror opposite of what you find in the tradition that we're talking about, the tradition of historical materialism and dialectical materialism, because it's all about the individual thinker, their genius ideas that are capable of producing a unique and singular product that nobody else can produce. Because that's another thing about their system of ideas, is at the end of the day, if you look at a system like Badiou's or a system like Žižek's, whether or not something is true within it depends on what they say. It doesn't depend on testing those claims in reality. And so that unique product is linked directly to the quote unquote individual genius who has purportedly produced them. And they're supposed to be consumed through internal analysis, right? Because they're sold as products, and what you're supposed to do is read them and analyze them internally, not necessarily raise questions like the questions that I raise. And that is, well, why was this product of the global theory industry produced? And what are the material forces behind its production and its promotion? And so in all of those ways, I think that the theoretical practice that Žižek and Badiou are invested in reveals itself to be anti-Marxist. It's an anti-communist, right? It's more a theoretical practice that is very widespread within the capitalist world and within the larger theory industry. One great example of this that I'll just give a shout out to is I wouldn't actually encourage anyone to read it, but Badiou's book called The Century, which was based on a seminar that he gave on the 20th century. I followed the seminar and then I read the book. By the end of the book, it becomes very clear that the 20th century is the century of a confrontation between Badiou's ideas, his philosophic system fighting itself out across, decades and decades. I mean, the level of just profound navel-gazing narcissism is just incredible. But on top of that, it again reveals the nature of this theoretical practice and the kind of opportunism and the social chauvinism that saturates it, because it's a theoretical practice that is not really interested in giving us, and Badiou says at the beginning of the book, I'm not going to give you a historical analysis of the 20th century. I'm going to give you a philosophic account of the 20th century. So he's not participating in a collective project of understanding the history of the 20th century so that we can learn from it, so that we can organize our movements around it and other such things. No, he's branding the 20th century in terms of his philosophic system and taking this empirical, basically empirical data that he cherry picks, a poem here, an event here, etc., and he fits it all and shoehorns it all within his overall philosophic system. And so all of that, I think, demonstrates the extent to which their theoretical practices are really, unfortunately, it's unfortunate because they're people who are well trained. They have a lot of time to do analysis and have research assistants, I'm sure, and things like this. So it'd be great if they would kind of come over to our side and put their mind to use, instead of for their individual careers, to use for collective humanity and for collective projects. But Unfortunately, it doesn't look like that's in the cards, and they're both older gentlemen, so I don't think that they'll be giving up on their careers at this point in time.
Yeah, we spoke about a month or so ago with Vivek Shibber, and there's something that he said, which is that insofar as they can continue publishing a bunch of stuff and living comfortably, it doesn't seem like it's going to change much within the academy. They're going to have the material incentive to continue their practice. Can you talk a little bit about their usage? Maybe Zizek specifically, but if you want Zizek and Badiou, their usage of Lacan and Althusser, and specifically the latter, so Althusser's concept of interpolation and how they view it.
Yeah, in the French intellectual and political scene, Althusser really is an important hinge figure because there's, in a certain sense, Althusser has a foot in two camps. Probably more camps than that, but for the sake of argument, he has one foot in the French Communist Party and in dedication to a certain form of Marxism, Leninism, and he was dedicated to the Marxist tradition and has some insightful analyses of various aspects of that tradition. At the same time, he, of course, has a deep interest in, or had, I should say, psychoanalysis, and really much of his work was subjected to the influence of Lacan. And that influence, I think, really set the stage for a lot of the figures that we're talking about, who I would refer to as Lacano-Althusserians. Just as the Frankfurt schools often referred to as Freudo-Marxists, we have in the latter half of the 20th century, and in many ways there's deep, deep continuities between these traditions that would be fascinating to unpack and talk more about. But the Lacanian Althusserians are ones who take fundamental insights from the Marxist tradition. And again, this is the same as with the Freudo-Marxists, but they merge these insights with a framework of analysis that is not historical materialist, but is based on or emerges out of, both Freud and Lacan for that matter, a kind of, at best, liberal ideology within the capitalist core, right? So what you do is you take a Marxist discourse, a non-Marxist discourse, founded on liberal ideology, and more specifically, definitely in the case of Freud, like colonial ideology, patriarchal ideology, and other such things, and you do a mashup. And that mashup does not work out so well. Not because there should not be a Marxist account of psychology and psychoanalysis. On the contrary, I'm very dedicated to that. I think it's extremely important. And there's excellent work. You know, Vygotsky comes to mind, but there's a lot of other people who work in that particular tradition because you need an analysis of the social totality. And human psychology is a very important factor in the social totality. But the Freudian and Lacanian traditions, unfortunately, and you see this very clearly in Freud, you know, his model for psychoanalysis was basically the white bourgeois male European subject. And that undergirded so much of the way in which he understood the so-called human psyche. And so the universal descriptions that you have are actually a description of a very particular psychological formation. And there's not an analysis of the social production of that psychological formation. And so Freud, of course, and you find some of this in Lacan as well, traffics in a lot of colonial patriarchal discourses, et cetera. And there's excellent, excellent critiques of both Freud and Lacan on that front. You know, Karl Schwarzkopf's work on Freud, or Lucy Rigorai's critiques of Lacan, and there are many other examples that one could point to. And so Althusser was very, very influenced by Lacan, and that led to really fundamental problems in his understanding of ideology. And the famous ideology essay, Ideological State Apparatuses, is an article, it's actually, you know, a chapter in an unfinished book that itself really manifests this split. Because about half of the analysis is rooted in a Marxist account of ideological state apparatuses. But then in these strange points in the essay, he introduces what is very easily understandable as Lacan's mirror stage as a way of describing ideology. The mirror stage, in a nutshell, is the moment at which the subject recognizes their image in the other and becomes constituted qua subject. And Althusser's interpolation scene is modeled on Lacan's mirror stage, because what happens is, he says, an individual is walking down the street, is hailed by a police officer, and in turning around and recognizing that they're the one who's been called by the police officer, they recognize themselves as a subject, as an ideological subject, in the image put forth by the other, the police officer. But of course, the problem, and Althusser actually says it quite explicitly in the essay himself, is that this interpolation scene contradicts in profound ways the entire analysis of ideology that he had outlined in the preceding part of the essay. In particular, it presupposes that there's an individual who would somehow be outside of ideology and then called into ideology. Of course, Althusser himself says early in the essay, we're always already ideological subjects because we're born within a society that constructs us and composes us ideologically. It also suggests, and this is one of the big problems with a lot of the people coming out of this Lacano-Althusserian tradition, who almost all don't focus on the materialist theory of ideology in the kind of Marxist side of Althusser, but instead on the subjective side, right, the turn to the subject, is it suggests that, well, maybe a subject could just keep walking or like ignore the cop and therefore just ignore ideology. And so it traffics very explicitly in the liberal ideology of the free subject who can, just cut their ties and, run away or do other such things. And there's plenty of kind of later thinkers who draw on this tradition and say various things along those lines. And so Althusser, unfortunately, really opened up the floodgates to this more liberal mode of analysis within debates around ideology. They're focused on the subject and the freedom of the subject, etc. And really, ultimately, and we could tie this back, Carlos, to, it sounds like, our very shared interest in making sure that dialectics is at the center of any understanding of the social totality, because the fetishization of the subject and the possibility that the subject would turn away or do other such things is really a non-dialectical way of understanding the process of ideology. And with Jennifer Ponce de Leon, one of the things that we've been developing in a book project that we're working on, and this is, of course, collectively drawing on the deep tradition of historical materialism, is a compositional model of ideology, meaning understanding ideology not in terms of, oh, there's a social structure over here and a subject over here, and the social structure just implants itself onto the subject, and that's how ideology works. We're just formatted like, a cookie cutter formats a cookie. That's not how ideology works. Ideology is a dialectical process, and it's a process by which subjects are collectively, over time, composed within a social totality. And they're composed not only in the way in which they think and understand the world, but they're also composed in the way in which they feel, their affects towards the world, the way they perceive the world, the words and the discourse they use to talk about the world. All of those things are composed out of the social totality. And there's not a determined relationship and a rigorous, like, reductivist relationship, but the agency that's mobilized is always an agency within a process of ideological composition. And so the compositional model of ideology is dialectical through and through. There's not structure and subject. There's a process of composition in which, if we use these terms, and we have to use them carefully so that one doesn't fall back into non-dialectical thinking, we could say that subjects are composed out of structures that they themselves contribute to composing in various ways. And it's the limit of our concepts that makes us think in these rigid terms like structure and subject, instead of being able to develop more complex vocabulary for articulating this process, right? And dialectics, amongst other things, is the way in which we can identify the limits of our conceptual understanding and thereby tap into elements from material reality that surpass our conceptual categories, right? So there's not just subject and society or structure or something like that. There's instead these complex material processes of collective composition, and for that matter, recomposition, because a lot of the focus that you get in the Lacanian and Althusserian traditions is on the subject and its interpolation, so it's all individualized. But ideology is collective, and the process of ideological recomposition, right, of breaking out of dominant ideology. If you read Žižek or you read, Badiou or people like this, It's often in terms of this like Messiah complex that I'm going to read a book and I'm going to realize everybody's wrong and I'm right. And that's going to be my magic pill moment, like in the Matrix. And I'm going to see through things and be outside of ideology. That's not how, I mean, that's how it works in Hollywood. And that's why they tell us these magic button theories of ideology in Hollywood, because it's not true. The way in which ideological recomposition operates is it's a collective project that is material through and through, and it depends to a very large extent on various social structures and institutions that recompose, right? And so we don't just do this individually or idiosyncratically or in an isolated manner. And it's one of the principal reasons why we have to not only work collectively to recompose our ideology, but we have to do it through institution building, through building organizations and parties and associations that create a different net material set of forces that compose subjects in very different ways. And anyone who spent a lot of time in organizing spaces or traveled to actually existing socialist countries or things like this knows exactly what I'm talking about, right? Because you can walk into spaces or be part of communities in which the center of gravity is such that your kind of participation in that community or that environment interpolates you, if I was to use the misplaced Althusserian vocabulary slightly more correctly, in a way that would draws out and recomposes you or potentially recomposes you in significant ways. And that's one of the reasons that the exit from ideology isn't individual. It's something that we have to do together, and we have to help one another do it. And it's not like you just get to the promised land and then you're done, because ideology's so complex. It's not just the cop who's like, hey, are you, Gabriel Rockhill? No, it's our affect. It's even our desires, what we find attractive, what we find disgusting. Like all of these different layers of ideological composition have to be recomposed, and that's an ongoing process. And even within socialist countries, of course, Che pointed this out quite poignantly, that process of ideological composition goes on and on and on, right? So it's the remaking of humanity through its shared collective endeavors of recomposition. I've probably gone a little, too at length into this particular question, but I think it really hits home, because that Lacanian and Althusserian approach, I think, really leads to a dead end, and that a dialectical understanding of ideology qua collective compositional force leads not only to, I think, a better theoretical description of ideology, but also has much better far-reaching practical consequences, because it brings us into a collective community of recomposition, which I think is part of what Midwestern Marx is invested in. It's part of what I'm invested in my organizing. It's part of what I'm invested in as a teacher. It's part of what I'm invested in the critical theory workshop. And so these are things that we need to do together, because they give us spaces and they empower us and they allow us to leverage power away from the dominant forces in the society that we live in.
I think that's wonderfully said. I wholeheartedly agree with the way that the theory of interpolation is grounded on a deep form of liberalism. And I see it embedded in the way that communism is kind of seen as an identity in the West. In other specifically socialist countries, if you say you're a communist, what's implied is that you're a member of a communist party. In the US, at least, when you say you're a communist, it means you're an individual who believes in the ideas of communism. And I think part of the paradox that emerges when it's so deeply identified at the individual level is that there is maybe an unconscious interest in not achieving socialism, because it would mean a loss of identity, a loss of being able to label yourself as an individual socialist within the existing capitalist order. I found your development of the project that you're working on with Jennifer Ponce de Leon of the compositional theory of ideology pretty interesting, and it reminded me of Richard Levins and Richard Lewontin, who are both Marxist evolutionary biologists and who have developed the notion of subject-object as a way of thinking dialectically about subjectivity. And as far as Althusser's essay, I mean, give me a better example of dropping the ball halfway. You're going pretty good, you're doing good, and then out of nowhere, it just it goes to shit. So do you think that sort of split is part of the reason why Althusser's students Some end up going down the route of Badiou and what you call transcendental idealism, and others down the route of, quite literally, basically founding postmodernism.
Yeah, definitely put the Richard Levin book in the notes if you could, because I don't know it and I'd love to check it out. Yeah, I think that the post-Althusser, or the kind of neo-Althusserians, those who studied with him or followed his seminar or were close to him, people like Badiou and Žižek, but then also people like Rancière, Etienne Balibar, and Pierre Macheret, and others of that sort, that, they each have their own individual trajectories in various ways. But one thing that is very revealing is the direct relationship between their merging of Marxian, not necessarily Marxist, but Marxian, so vaguely Marxist elements, with other discourses and other theoretical practices. The more they have done that historically, the more the star of their brand tends to rise within the global theory industry. Right? So someone like Balibar is very interesting. He had a very clear Derridian turn and has become very, very invested in a kind of, his discourse itself is very Derridian in very many ways. And he has become a major, major figure in the Anglophone world, and regular invited to Columbia and things like this. Is very different than some of his very, very early work on the dictatorship of the proletariat and other things. And, so you see, I think one of the things that is really important is to recognize that, just as we have a music industry or a clothing industry, we have a theory industry. And the people who work in that industry are, for the most part, competing with one another to advance their careers. And that the radical recuperators within that framework know very well and very clearly, and actually I should say very explicitly, that I know this because that's how I was trained, and that was my intellectual habitus. That was my ideological composition of an earlier version of myself. Was I knew full well that what I needed to do was brand market myself in such a way that I was radical, but I had my own terminology and my own system and my own way of explaining things that engaged with all these thinkers and all of their symbolic capital that I could leverage for myself, but that I had my own brand that I was pushing forward. And that to push that brand didn't mean reading and engaging seriously with Lenin or Lasordo or Parenti or Claudia Jones or, a lot of the figures that we've been talking about, or traditions for that matter that we've been talking about. No, it meant engaging with Leclau and Rancière and, Judith Butler and the trendsetters of these various traditions. And so I think that that's a big part of the way in which those traditions operate, is that the capitalist cultural apparatus, the system of production, circulation, and reception, relates to ideologically composed subjects who are the intellectuals who operate within it, who know and feel the uplift of the system. They know that, well, oh, this Derridian thing that I'm doing kind of got me invited to a lot of things, and I got some keynotes, and wow, I got to publish in this really prestigious press that doesn't really like that, crass, orthodox, vulgar Marxist stuff that I used to do, or maybe I used to read, or other such things. And so that phenomenon of uplift, I think, really clearly highlights the relationship between the opportunism of the individuals who recognize that if they give to the system what they want, they're going to have very, very lucrative careers. And that has really pernicious effects. I see it all the time, and it's really hard to break with. Like, my own self-critique, which for that matter is ongoing, is painful. It's really difficult to look yourself in the mirror and say, okay, I've been invested in things that I'm ashamed of. And in order to take that self-critique to the highest possible level, I actually have to really understand the system that has produced these phenomena, the people who participate in it, call it out for what it is, not because I have an axe to grind with individuals. Like, I really want to, bury a hatchet in, Žižek's chest or something like that. I actually don't really, as far as an individual goes, he's not my audience. Like, I don't really care. Sorry, Žižek, I don't really care. What I care about is understanding the system that produced a charlatan like him, and that hoodwinked someone like myself and hoodwinks a lot of other people, and that pushes a lot of potentially radical intellectuals or activists into an impasse. And so my own work is a self-critical work that consists in diagnosing that, not just for the pleasure of, writing a hit piece or calling somebody out on their bullshit or something like that. It's really the positive aspect to it for me is primary. That is, if I understand how the system works, I can elucidate how it operates. I can help other people understand it as well, while pulling on what other people have done in their critiques of this system. I think that we'll be better positioned to move theoretical practices in a direction that actually have relevance to the struggle of humanity that we're in, which is, apocalyptic at this point. If you take seriously the situation with capitalist-driven global warming, the threats of nuclear war and World War III, and just the crumbling of the capitalist system in general. And so the stakes of class struggle are very, very high. And I wouldn't want to get kind of, sidetracked in kind of individual attacks. We've got to keep our eye on the system and our eye on the prize of collectively developing theoretical practices that are healthy, that are sober, and that are directed towards a revolutionary optimism. Because if we don't turn this world around, then the world is going to go straight into a wall, because that's where it's currently headed. And it's quite obvious, I think, based on a number of different factors that we could look at.
That's wonderfully said. And I think one of the sad parts is that even though you're doing this, one of the reactions which I've seen people say is that it's just like an individual vendetta against Žižek, when it's absolutely not. And it makes me think, are some of these people even capable of thinking beyond just that very individualistic framework and realize that you're looking at the objective forces which have allowed something like a Žižek, along with many others, to have arisen. Sort of the last question or the second to last question that I wanted to ask you is, do you think the left has what some have called a professional managerial class, or for short PMC problem? And if so, what role do you think this has played in the popularity that Žižek has in social democratic or democratic socialist organizations?
Yeah, we should do a few sessions on this because it's an enormous but really important question. I'll just highlight a few issues. One is that we need, and people are developing, some people have done some great work, and Radhika Desai comes to mind, Zach Cope comes to mind, Nikos Poulantzas is some of his politics I disagree with, but he has some great analyses of what he refers to as the new petty bourgeoisie. And this is the professional managerial class stratum in the imperial core. Very important to highlight that, I think, because we always have to keep the international perspective in mind, as well as the way in which neoliberalism has offshored, a lot of forms of production and has developed a more kind of bloated service and professional managerial class stratum within the imperial core. And that phenomenon, which I think we really need more developed analyses of, does have an enormous impact, of course, on organizing, because this professional managerial class stratum is one that I think it's important to say that it's not really, like in the strict sense, it's not really a class, in the sense that you have two classes. You have the class that owns the means of production and the class that can only survive by selling its labor to those who own the means of production. And the professional managerial class stratum is sandwiched between these two in certain ways, often will not be in the productive sector, but still working for a wage. And so anyway, there's a lot of things that would need to be analyzed in that professional managerial class stratum. But one of the things that it does is that it works for the capitalists. But at the same time, the radical recuperators, or those who think of themselves as progressives within the professional managerial class stratum, often want to think that they're on the side of the people. And so they'll position themselves, posture themselves, put themselves forth as if they're defending the rights of the average person, or on the side of workers, or things like this. Sometimes this might be legitimate, sometimes it might be disingenuous in various ways. But that stratum, given the fact that it's actually working for the capitalist ruling class in the imperial core, has interests driven by the material base that go against some of the interests of the working class. So in that regard, the petty bourgeois class stratum is often quite a contradictory class stratum. And there's so many great analyses going back to Marx and Engels that point out that the petty bourgeois class stratum is one that is very frenetic. It doesn't have a stable politics. It can bounce back and forth. It can realign in various ways, going from fascism to liberalism, for that matter. And sometimes it also traffics in a belief in third way politics, right? That there's some way out of this confrontation between capital and labor. And this could be through utopian socialism. It could be through democratic socialism. It could be through anarchism. It could be through liberalism. But third way politics is very, very prevalent within the imperialist PMC. And so that all leads to, yes, I do think that there is a profound problem with the PMC stratum within the imperialist core. And that what we need to do is develop, based on some of the work that I referenced just very quickly, really robust analyses of the political economy, of the production of this class stratum, how it operates and how it's changed under the neoliberal phase of capitalism, but then also what its various political roles have been. One of the thinkers from France, Iskra, is going to put out a book by Émeric Monville on Michel Clouscar, and I could spell that name and put it in the notes if you'd like. One of the things that Clouscar has pointed out is that the petty bourgeois class stratum in the imperial core, he's thinking of France in particular, also plays a really specific function, because one of the things that it does is it traffics in a consumerist utopia of desire, in which the PMC, given the wages of imperialism and given often the kind of social and economic standing that's superior to that of the working class, they can be major consumers. They can, go on vacation in various places and go to the movies and buy lots of books and t-shirts and whatever, And so consumerism is a big part of the PNC stratum. And one of the principal ways in which the politics then manifests itself is through a politics of consumerism, which I had alluded to earlier, meaning buying up Žižek books and going to a trendy talk at an art gallery on the, on the Lower East Side in New York City, as opposed to joining a workers' organization or getting involved in some other way. And that consumerism, or that consumerist politics, I think, is another big part of the problem, in addition to the fact that identity politics plays such a central role in the PMC stratum, because identity politics, understood, I'm thinking here of the work of Adolf Reed Jr. and others, understood as a kind of politics that evacuates class analysis in favor of reified, non-dialectical identities that are then embraced, defended, valorized, fetishized, and then politics becomes a politics of representation, but a representation that competes within the PMC stratum for elevating one's particular identity. Right? So if you're in institutions like I am, or you are familiar with the way in which a lot of PMC institutions function, there is very clear and explicit competition within this diversity industry for who's going to be the next spokesperson, who's going to have their identity category become an identity category that gets jobs, that gets valorized within that larger kind of consumerist mentality, or that consumerist network of the PMC stratum. And so, I haven't, of course, answered the question in full, other than to say that I couldn't agree more that it is a really important problem, and that we need to continue to collectively develop analyses of its formation and its political consequences, because it's really, I think, plays an extremely significant role as well in the policing of hegemony and the controlled counter-hegemony, to use the term that you brought up earlier, which I think is really spot on. And so it does play a very central ideological role.
That's wonderfully said. I had a note here. I'm excited to hear that Michel Clouscar is being printed in English. I think that his critique of 68 is something that is very pertinent today. Let me roll into the next question, the last one. What have the reactions to your article been like?
Oh, they've only been positive.
As usual. Right.
Yeah, well, you know that social media lends itself to sober, healthy exchanges in which people engage fully with one's arguments and analyze the evidence, and it's basically like a science writ large. So no, the reactions, they've been varied. I was surprised actually that it blew up as much as it did, in part because it's quite a long article. And it does actually also engage with some of the philosophic elements, which I thought was important because I didn't want the cheap critique of, oh, he doesn't know Lacan or he's never read Žižek. It's like, give me a break. I've read way too much of that guy. You have no idea. Like, I was reading him before you were born. Please get off Twitter and like go do something else. So that's one thing. But there were some kind of, negative reactions, but a lot of the negative reactions, you could just tell by the way they were formulated that they didn't actually read the article. And they ignored the 99 footnotes of documentation. So it's just kind of disingenuous dismissal, which of course is very common on social media because you're just looking for whatever hot takes and things like that. And I actually like disagreement, but I like it when it helps the collective project of intellectual elucidation grow. And so if people have disagreements with me, work through those footnotes, analyze all of the data that I've looked at, produce a better analysis and explanation of all of that data, publish that, humiliate me in the process if you can, and I would be thrilled, because the goal is the scientific analysis of society, of history, of the world that we live in. And the best explanatory framework wins, as well as the most powerful explanatory framework for actually contributing to practical struggles, right? Because of course, the purpose isn't only to describe the world, but to develop the tools necessary to transform it. I haven't seen that forthcoming, meaning somebody who actually takes all of the evidence seriously and says, well, I ran the same experiment and I came out with these results and I have a better explanatory model and it disproves Rockhill. I would read it in a second and I would read it with alacrity. That said, I also have had a lot of positive feedback just from people who I think felt empowered. A lot of comments like, I always kind of thought this guy was a charlatan, and it's great that somebody who has been trained in this stuff took the effort to go through and demonstrate that. Or other people who have said, yeah, he kind of smelled wrong, and I never really dug that deeply into his books. My hope, and, I shouldn't look on social media to find this hope realized probably, but my hope would be that this would be a contribution to this kind of, there's a few people who reached out to me that clearly are pushing in this direction. There's a large, very consolidated community of the PMC stratum that we were just talking about, who worship the kind of golden calves of the theory industry. And you cannot say anything vaguely critical of Adorno or Horkheimer or Žižek or Foucault or the other people I've criticized. Because if you do, you will be banished. They're not going to engage with your argument. They're going to slander you, they're going to banish you, and that's it. That is a very negative response. And it is clearly one of gatekeepers who are fond of keeping the game going. And they do not want someone like me pointing out the nature of this game. I would hope, though, and I certainly have had some positive responses in this regard, that an article like this or some of the other work that I would do would help empower other intellectuals and activists who are oriented in the same direction to continue to develop a community of rigorous, refreshing engagements with Marxism and with a critical analysis of the social totality. And so the most positive reactions, honestly, have been, this guy named Carlos Garrido who reached out to me and was like, hey, could we interview you on Midwestern Marx? Or other people like that who are part of communities of scholarship, but also communities of activism that are really energized and want to be part of, this ongoing collective process of elucidating the world. And that's invigorating, right? It's not that exciting to me to prove that somebody's wrong I knew Žižek was wrong when I was 24. I've known that for a long time. And it didn't even need to be proven. What's much more interesting and invigorating is it's very clear to me that there is a very insurgent intellectual and political community within the worlds that I operate in that is no longer simply gonna lay down and take this shit and assume that whatever the kind of rad lib theory industry said was hot and cool and right and sexy and revolutionary is actually that. And that's exactly what we need. We need a lot more class consciousness. We need a lot more awareness of what's going on. And we need to empower ourselves collectively to develop the type of theory that the theory industry simply isn't giving us.
Wonderfully said again. You've smashed quite a few idols now. Foucault, Horkheimer, Adorno, Žižek. Who else is going to get the Rockhill hammer?
Well, this is part of a book project, and the book project is focused on an analysis of the global theory industry as a specific element within the capitalist cultural apparatus that itself is nested within the superstructure of the capitalist system. And so the book project outlines that kind of systemic framework of analysis and a form of cultural and intellectual critique. That is the kind of frame, if you will, for the book. But then within that, there are chapters, some of which deal with an expansive number of intellectuals. In particular, there's a chapter that looks at the not the radical recuperators that we're talking about, but the imperial intellectuals, the people like Hannah Arendt and Fukuyama and the Huntingtons, and the people who are like national security state operatives, like directly national security state operatives who pass themselves off as intellectuals. So that's one element of it, but another is also a kind of institutional analysis of a lot of the material forces that are driving the theory industry and the cultural apparatus in general. So I look very explicitly at the US national security state. I look at the British national security state. I look at the way in which the capitalist apparatus of knowledge production functions. There's a lot on the foundations and how they operate, Ford and Carnegie and Rockefeller and all of their involvement in the intellectual world war. And then some of the later chapters do look at the Frankfurt School, Foucault. There is a chapter on the philosophy of difference that looks at Derrida's involvement in anti-communist organizing, Deleuze as well, who of course claimed that all revolutions fail and other such things. There's a section also on, well, some of that is a bit, I don't know exactly what form that's going to take, because there are other individuals who kind of crop up in various ways. But what I want it to really be is an analysis of the consolidation of the intellectual compatible left in the post-World War II era and the impact that has had intellectually, but also, of course, politically and practically. And so, I mean, the title of the book, I think, says it clear. It's the intellectual world war, meaning the war on the intellectual world war on Marxism and the attempt to deplatform it, cancel it, discredit it, delegitimate it. And so a big part of the project also is marshaling and putting forth the positive elements from those traditions so that people don't just leave the book thinking, oh, you know, there's all this horrible stuff and there's nothing to be done about it. No, all the horrible stuff is just, that's like the earth that you have to dig up and excavate to get to the really good stuff, which has been hidden to a large extent, at least within the academy and some of the publishing industry, by the various forces that I'm talking about.
Excellent. I look forward to it. Folks, we have been speaking here with Gabriel Rockhill about his article, Capitalism's Court Jester, Slavoj Žižek, which is linked to the description of this live stream. If you haven't read it, please go ahead and read it. It's wonderfully insightful, but even just the style of writing, the images that you use, and there's a few times where you rhyme. I don't know if that was intentional, but when I read that, I was like, was that immortal critique, immortal technique that just like went in there and inserted a few phrases? But wonderful article, and I think a wonderful discussion. You greatly elaborated on very important themes. Is there anything you would like to plug before we go?
Well, there's a few projects that are upcoming that people might be interested in. The Critical Theory Workshop is an educational nonprofit that I run with Jennifer Ponce de Leon. We're doing a book launch for Derek Ford's book with Iskra that's coming up soon, I think even in a week or two. Check out criticaltheoryworkshop.com for info. Jennifer Ponce de Leon and I are also writing the introduction, or we finished the introduction to Domenico Lusordo's Western Marxism, that's coming out with 1804 books, that's housed at the People's Forum in New York, and that'll be out in the early spring, I hope, and we'll do some book launches and things like that. And we have our summer school that we do through the Critical Theory Workshop that is both in person in Paris, but then also online. And we're really dedicated to continuing to develop, because we actually already have a really nice community of rigorous scholars who are dedicated to collectively understanding the world. And so the door's open, and we're really kind of excited about continuing to build that community and continuing to connect with our comrades at Midwestern Marx and other organizations like this, because we have to do it together, and we have to have a lot of different sites of struggle, a lot of different forms of institution building. So those are just a few things that I'll mention.
Great. Well, with that, I guess we can go. Thanks to everyone who watched, and thank you again, Professor Rockhill, for being here.